The Parasite by Arthur C. Clarke. Read by Hugh Carr. Directed by Brendan James. "There is nothing you can do," said Connelly. "Nothing at all. Why did you have to follow me?" He was standing with his back to Pearson, staring out across the calm blue water that led to Italy. On the left, behind the anchored fishing fleet, the sun was setting in Mediterranean splendor. But neither man was even remotely aware of the beauty all around. Pearson rose to his feet and came forward out of the little cafe's shadowed porch into the slanting sunlight. He joined Connelly by the cliff wall, but was careful not to come close to him. Even in normal times, Connelly disliked being touched. His obsession, whatever it might be, would make him doubly sensitive now. "Listen, Roy," Pearson began urgently. "We've been friends for 20 years, and you ought to know I wouldn't let you down this time. Besides—" "I know. You promised Ruth." "And why not? After all, she is your wife. She has a right to know what's happened." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She's worried, Roy. Much more worried than if it had been only another woman." He nearly added the word again, but decided against it. Connelly stubbed out his cigarette on the flat-topped granite wall, then flicked the white cylinder out over the sea so that it fell twisting and turning toward the waters 100 feet below. He turned to face his friend. "I'm sorry, Jack," he said, and for a moment there was a glimpse of the familiar personality which Pearson knew must be trapped somewhere within the stranger standing at his side. "I know you're trying to be helpful, and I appreciate it, but I wish you hadn't followed me. You'll only make the matters worse." "Convince me of that, and I'll go away," Connelly sighed. "I could no more convince you than that psychiatrist you persuaded me to see. Poor Curtis. He was such a well-meaning fellow. Give him my apologies, will you?" "I'm not a psychiatrist, and I'm not trying to cure you, whatever that means. If you like it the way you are, that's your affair. But I think you ought to let us know what's happened, so we can make plans accordingly." "To get me certified?" Pearson shrugged his shoulders. He wondered if Connelly could see through his feigned indifference to the real concern he was trying to hide. Now that all other approaches seemed to have failed, the "frankly I don't care" attitude was the only one left open to him. "I wasn't thinking of that. There are a few practical details to worry about. Do you want to stay here indefinitely? You can't live without money, even on Cyrene." "I can stay at Clifford Rawlsley's villa as long as I like. He was a friend of my father's, you know. It's empty at the moment, except for the servants. They don't bother me." Connelly turned away from the parapet on which he was resting. "I'm going up the hill before it's dark," he said. The words were abrupt, but Pearson knew that he was not being dismissed. He could follow if he pleased, and the knowledge brought him the first satisfaction he had felt since locating Connelly. It was a small triumph, but he needed it. They did not speak during the climb. Indeed, Pearson scarcely had the breath to do so. Connelly set off at a reckless pace, as if deliberately attempting to exhaust himself. The island fell away beneath them, the white villas gleaming like ghosts in the shadowed valleys, the little fishing boats their day's work done, lay at rest in the harbour. All around was the darkling sea. When Pearson caught up with his friend, Connelly was sitting in front of the shrine, which the devout islanders had built on Cyrene's highest point. In the daytime, there would be tourists here, photographing each other or gaping at the much-advertised beauty spread beneath them. But the place was deserted now. Connelly was breathing heavily from his exertions, yet his features were relaxed, and for the moment he seemed almost at peace. The shadow that lay across his mind had lifted, and he turned to Pearson with a smile that echoed his old infectious grin. "He hates exercise, Jack. It always scares him away."
"And who is he?" said Pearson. "Remember, you haven't introduced us yet."
Connelly smiled at his friend's attempted humour. Then his face suddenly became grave. "Tell me, Jack," he began, "would you say I have an overdeveloped imagination?"
"No, you're about average. You're certainly less imaginative than I am."
Connelly nodded slowly. "That's true enough, Jack. It should help you to believe me, because I'm certain I could never have invented the creature who's haunting me. It really exists. I'm not suffering from paranoid hallucinations or whatever Dr. Curtis would call them. You remember Maud White? It all began with her. I met her at one of David Trescott's parties about 6 weeks ago. I just quarrelled with Ruth and I was fed up. We were both pretty tight. As I was staying in town, she came back to the flat with me." Pearson smiled inwardly. Poor Roy. It was always the same pattern, though he never seemed to realize it. Each affair was different to him, but to no one else. The eternal Don Juan, always seeking, always disappointed. Because what he sought could be found only in the cradle or the grave, but never between the two. I guess you'll laugh at what knocked me out. It seems so trivial, though it frightened me more than anything that's ever happened in my life. I simply went over to the cocktail cabinet and poured out the drinks, as I've done 100 times before. It wasn't until I'd handed one to Maud that I realised I'd filled 3 glasses. The act was so perfectly natural that at first I didn't recognise what it meant. Then I looked wildly around the room to see where the other man was. Even then I knew, somehow, that it wasn't a man. But of course he wasn't there. He was nowhere at all in the outside world. He was hiding deep down inside my own brain. The night was very still. The only sound, a thin ribbon of music winding up to the stairs from some cafe in the village below. The light of the rising moon sparkled on the sea overhead. The arms of the crucifix were silhouetted against the darkness. A brilliant beacon on the frontiers of twilight. Venus was following the sun into the west. Pearson waited, letting Connelly take his time. He seemed lucid and rational enough, however strange the story he was telling. His face was quite calm in the moonlight, though it might be the calmness that comes after acceptance of defeat. The next thing I remember is lying in bed while Maud sponged my face. She was pretty frightened. I'd passed out and cut my forehead badly as I fell. There was a lot of blood around the place, but that didn't matter. The thing that really scares me was the thought that I'd gone crazy. That seems funny. now that I'm much more scared of being sane. He was still there when I woke up. He's been there ever since. Somehow I got rid of Maud. Wasn't easy. I tried to work out what had happened. Tell me, Jack, do you believe in telepathy? The abrupt change caught Pearson off guard. I've never given it much thought, but the evidence seems rather convincing. Do you suggest that someone else is reading your mind? It's not as simple as that. What I'm telling you now I've discovered slowly. Usually, when I've been dreaming or slightly drunk. You may say that invalidates the evidence, but I don't think so. At first, it was the only way to break through the barrier that separates me from Omega. I'll tell you later why I've called him that. But now, there aren't any obstacles. I know he's there all the time, waiting for me to let down my guard. Night and day, drunk or sober, I'm conscious of his presence. At times like this, he's quiescent, watching me out of the corner of his eye. My only hope is that he'll grow tired of waiting and go in search of some other victim. Connelly's voice, calm until now, suddenly came near to breaking. Try and imagine the horror of that discovery. The effect of learning that every act, every thought and desire that flitted through your mind was being watched and shared by another being. It meant, of course, the end of all normal life for me. I had to leave Ruth, and I couldn't tell her why. Then, to make matters worse, Maud came chasing after me. She wouldn't leave me alone, and bombarded me with letters and phone calls. It was hell. I couldn't fight both of them, so I ran away. But I thought that on Serene, of all places, he would find enough to interest him without bothering me. Now I understand, said Pearson softly. So that's what he's after. A kind of telepathic peeping Tom, no longer content with mere watching. I suppose you're humouring me now, said Connelly, without resentment. But I don't mind. And you've summed it up pretty accurately, as you usually do. It was quite a while before I realised what his game was. Once the first shock had worn off, I tried to analyse the position logically. I thought backward from that first moment of recognition, and in the end, I knew that it wasn't a sudden invasion of my mind. He'd been with me for years, so well hidden that I'd never guessed it. I expect you'll laugh at this, knowing me as you do, but I've never been altogether at ease with a woman, even when I've been making love to her, and now I know the reason. Omega has always been there, sharing my emotions, gloating over the passions he can no longer experience in his body. The only way I kept any control was by fighting back, trying to come to grips with him and so understand what he was. And in the end, I succeeded. He's a long way away. There must be some limit to his powers. Perhaps the first contact was an accident, though I'm not sure. What I've told you already, Jack, must be hard enough for you to believe, but it's nothing to what I've got to say now. You remember, you agreed that I'm not an imaginative man, and see if you find a flaw anywhere in this story. I don't know if you've read any of the evidence suggesting that telepathy is somehow independent of time. I know that it is. Omega doesn't belong in our age. He's somewhere in the future, immensely far ahead of us. For a while I thought he must be one of the last men. That's why I gave him his name. But now I'm not sure. Perhaps he belongs to an age when there are a myriad different races of man scattered all over the universe, some still ascending, others sinking into decay. His people, wherever or whenever they may be, have reached the heights and fallen far from them into the depths the beasts can never know. There's a sense of evil about him, Jack, the real evil that most of us never meet in all our lives. Yet sometimes I almost feel sorry for him, because I know what has made him the thing he is. Have you ever wondered, Jack, what the human race will do when science has discovered everything, when there are no more worlds to be explored, when all the stars have given up their secrets? Omega is one of the answers. I hope he's not the only one, for if so, everything we've striven for is in vain. I hope that he and his race are an isolated cancer in a still healthy universe, but I can never be sure. They have pampered their bodies until they are useless, and too late they have discovered their mistake. Perhaps they have thought, as some men have thought, that they could live by intellect alone, and perhaps they are immortal, and that must be their real damnation. Through the ages their minds have been corroding in their feeble bodies, seeking some release from their intolerable boredom. They have found it at last in the only way they can, by sending back their minds to an earlier, more virile age, and becoming parasites on emotions of others. I wonder how many of them there are. Perhaps they explain all cases of what used to be called possession. How they must have ransacked the past to assuage their hunger. Can't you picture them? Flocking like carrion crows around the decaying Roman Empire, jostling one another for the minds of Nero and Caligula and Tiberius. Perhaps Omega failed to get those richer prizes. Perhaps he hasn't much choice and must take whatever mind he can contact in any age, transferring from that to the next whenever he has the chance. It is only slowly, of course, that I worked all this out. I think it adds to his enjoyment to know that I'm aware of his presence. I think he's deliberately helping me, breaking down his side of the barrier, for in the end, I was able to see him. Connelly broke off, looking around. Pearson saw that they were no longer alone on the hilltop. A young couple, hand in hand, were coming up by the road toward the crucifix. Each had the physical beauty so common and so cheap among the islanders. They were oblivious to the night around them and to any spectators, and they went past without the least sign of recognition. There was a bitter smile on Connelly's lips as he watched them go. I suppose I should be ashamed of this, but I was wishing that he'd leave me and go after that boy. But he won't. Though I've refused to play his game anymore. He's staying to see what happens. "You were going to tell me what he's like," said Pearson, annoyed at the interruption. Connelly lit a cigarette and inhaled deeply before replying. "Can you imagine a room without walls? He's in a kind of hollow, egg-shaped space, surrounded by blue mist that always seems to be twisting and turning, but never changes its position. There's no entrance or exit, and no gravity, unless he's learned to defy it, because he floats in the centre. Round him is a circle of short, fluted cylinders, turning slowly in the air. I I think they must be machines of some kind obeying his will. And once there was a large oval hanging beside him with perfectly human, beautifully formed arms coming from it. He could only have been a robot, yet those hands and fingers seemed alive. They were feeding and massaging him, treating him like a baby. It was horrible. Have you ever seen a lemur or a spectral tarsier? He's something like that. A nightmare travesty of mankind with huge, malevolent eyes. And this is strange. It's not the way one imagined evolution going. He's covered with a fine layer of fur, as blue as the room in which he lives. Every time I've seen him, he's been in the same position, half curled up like a sleeping baby. I think his legs are completely atrophied. Perhaps his arms as well. Only his brain is still active, hunting up and down the ages for its prey. And now you know why there's nothing you or anyone else can do. Your psychiatrist might cure me if I was insane, but the science that can deal with Omega hasn't been invented yet. Connelly paused, then smiled wryly. Just because I'm sane, I realize that you can't be expected to believe me, so there's no common ground in which we can meet. Pearson rose from the boulder on which he had been sitting and shivered slightly. The night was becoming cold, but that was nothing to the feeling of inner helplessness that had been overwhelming him as Connelly spoke. "I'll be frank, Roy," he began slowly. "Of course I don't believe you. But insofar as you believe in Omega yourself, he's real to you, and I'll accept him on that basis and fight him with you. It may be a dangerous game. How do we know what he might do if he's cornered?" "I'll take the chance," Pearson replied, beginning to walk down the hill. Connelly followed him without argument. "Meanwhile, just what do you propose to do yourself?" "Relax. Avoid emotion. Above all, keep away from women. Ruth, Maud, and all the rest of them. That's been the hardest job. It isn't easy to break the habits of a lifetime." "I can well believe that," replied Pearson, a little dryly. "How successful have you been so far?" "Completely, you see. His own eagerness defeats his purpose by filling me with a kind of nausea and self-loathing whenever I think of sex. Lord, to think that I've laughed at the prudes all my life, yet now I've become one of them myself." There, thought Pearson in a sudden flash of insight, was the answer. He would never have believed it, but Connelly's past was finally catching up with him. Omega was nothing more than a symbol of conscience, a personification of guilt. When Connelly realized this, he would cease to be haunted. As for the remarkably detailed nature of the hallucination, that was yet another example of the tricks the human mind can play in its efforts to deceive itself. There must be some reason why the obsession had taken this form, but that was of minor importance. Pearson explained this to Connelly at some length as they approached the village. The other listened so patiently that Pearson had an uncomfortable feeling that he was the one who was being humoured. But he continued grimly to the end. When he had finished, Connelly gave a short, mirthless laugh. "Your story's as logical as mine, but neither of us can convince the other. If you're right, then in time I may return to normal. I can't disprove the probability. I simply don't believe it. You can't imagine how real Omega is to me. He's more real than you are. If I close my eyes, you're gone, but he's still there. I wish I knew what he was waiting for. I've left my old life behind. He knows I won't go back to it while he's there. So what's he got to gain by hanging on? He turned to Pearson with a feverish eagerness. That's what really frightens me, Jack. He must know what my future is. All my life must be like a book he can dip into where he pleases. So there must be some experience ahead of me that he's waiting to savor. Sometimes I wonder if it's my death. They were now among the houses at the outskirts of the village, and ahead of them the nightlife of Serene was getting into its stride. Now that they were no longer alone, there came a subtle change in Connelly's attitude. On the hilltop he had been, if not his normal self, at least friendly and prepared to talk. But now the sight of the happy, carefree crowds ahead seemed to make him withdraw into himself. He lagged behind as Pearson advanced, and presently refused to come any further.
"What's the matter?" asked Pearson. "Surely you'll come down to the hotel and have dinner with me?"
Connelly shook his head.
"I can't," he said. "I'd meet too many people." It was an astonishing remark from a man who had always delighted in crowds and parties. It showed, as nothing else had done, how much Connelly had changed. But before Pearson could think of a suitable reply, the other had turned on his heels and made off up a side street. Hurt and annoyed, Pearson started to pursue him, and then decided it was useless. That night, he sent a long telegram to Ruth, giving what reassurance he could. Then, tired out, he went to bed. Yet for an hour, he was unable to sleep. His body was exhausted, but his brain was still active. He lay, watching the patch of moonlight move across the pattern on the wall, marking the passage of time as inexorably as it must still do in the distant age that Connelly had glimpsed. Of course, that was pure fantasy, yet against his will, Pearson was growing to accept Omega as a real and living threat. And in a sense, Omega was real as those other mental abstractions, the ego and the subconscious mind. Pearson wondered if Connelly had been wise to come back to Serene. In times of emotional crisis, there had been others, though none so important as this. Connelly's reaction was always the same. He would return again to the lovely island where his charming, feckless parents had borne him and where he had spent his youth. He was seeking now, Pearson well knew enough, the contentment he had known only for one period of his life, and which he had sought so vainly in the arms of Ruth and all those others who had been unable to resist him. Pearson was not attempting to criticize his unhappy friend. He never passed judgments. He merely observed with a bright-eyed, sympathetic interest that was hardly tolerance, since tolerance implied the relaxation of standards, which he had never possessed. After a restless night, Pearson finally dropped into a sleep so sound that he awoke an hour later than usual. He had breakfast in his room and went down to the reception desk to see if there was any reply from Ruth. Someone else had arrived in the night. 2 traveling cases, obviously English, were stacked in the corner of the hall, waiting for the porter to move them. Idly curious, Pearson glanced at the labels to see who his compatriot might be. Then he stiffened, looked hastily around, and hurried across to the receptionist. "This Englishwoman," he said anxiously. "When did she arrive?"
"An hour ago, senor, on the morning boat."
"Is she in now?" The receptionist looked a little undecided, then capitulated gracefully.
"No, senor, she was in a great hurry and asked me where she might find Mr. Connelly. So I told her. Hoped I was all right."
Pearson cursed under his breath. It was an incredible stroke of bad luck, something he would never have dreamed of guarding against. Maud White was a woman of even greater determination than Connelly had hinted. Somehow, she had discovered where he had fled, and pride or desire or both had driven her to follow. That she had come to this hotel was not surprising. It was an almost inevitable choice for English visitors to Serene. As he climbed the road to the villa, Pearson fought against an increasing sense of futility and uselessness. He had no idea what he should do when he met Connelly and Maud. He merely felt a vague yet urgent impulse to be helpful. If he could catch Maud before she reached the villa, he might be able to convince her that Connelly was a sick man, and that her intervention could only do harm. Yet, was this true? It was perfectly possible that a touching reconciliation had already taken place, and that neither party had the least desire to see him. They were talking together on the beautifully laid-out lawn in front of the villa when Pearson turned through the gates and paused for breath. Connelly was resting on the wrought-iron seat beneath a palm tree, while Maud was pacing up and down a few yards away. She was speaking swiftly. Pearson could not hear her words, but from her intonation of her voice, she was obviously pleading with Connelly. It was an embarrassing situation. While Pearson was still wondering whether he could go forward, Connelly looked up and caught sight of him. His face was a completely expressionless mask. It showed neither welcome nor resentment. At the interruption, Maud spun round to see who her intruder was, and for the first time, Pearson glimpsed her face. She was a beautiful woman, but despair and anger had so twisted her features that she looked like a figure from some Greek tragedy. She was suffering not only the bitterness of being scorned, but the agony of not knowing why. Pearson's arrival must have acted as a trigger to her pent-up emotions. She suddenly whirled away from him and turned toward Connelly, who continued to watch her with lackluster eyes. For a moment, Pearson could not see what she was doing. Then he cried in horror, "Roy, look out!" Connelly moved with surprising speed. As if he had suddenly emerged from a trance, he caught Maud's wrist. There was a brief struggle, and then he was backing away from her, looking with fascination at something in the palm of his hand. The woman stood motionless, paralyzed with fear and shame, knuckles pressed against her mouth. Connelly gripped the pistol with his right hand and stroked it lovingly with his left. There was a low moan from Maud. "I only meant to frighten you. Roy, I swear it." "That's all right, my dear," said Connelly softly. "I believe you. There's nothing to worry about." His voice was perfectly natural. He turned toward Pearson and gave him his old, boyish smile. "So this is what he was waiting for, Jack," he said. I'm not going to disappoint him."
"No!"
gasped Pearson, white with terror.
"Don't, Roy, for God's sake!"
But Connelly was beyond the reach of his friend's entreaties as he turned the pistol to his head. In that same moment, Pearson knew at last with an awful clarity that Omega was real, and that Omega would now be seeking for a new abode. He never saw the flash of the gun or heard the feeble but adequate explosion. The world he knew had faded from his sight, and around him now were the fixed yet crawling mists of the blue room, staring from its center as they had stared down the ages at how many others were two vast and lidless eyes. They were satiated for the moment, but for the moment only. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Press the notification bell to be up to date with every new story. And as always, look out for the monsters.